Hello and welcome to the NevilleResearch.com video. Today I want to do part 2 on Love's Martyr, and I'm going to be talking about some related documents and books. And these things are not necessarily new discoveries, and they're quite easy to find on your own. So, for instance, this book we're going to look at, if you do a search on early English books online for the word phoenix near the word dove, this book will pop up, okay? So this is not a new discovery, but I want to share a new interpretation of what's going on here. So this book is from 1598. It's by William Rankins. It's called Seven Satires. And in addition to the seven satires, there's a poem about the phoenix. And who is this book dedicated to? John Salisbury. The same John Salisbury to whom Love's Martyr is dedicated. So, as other people have realized, there's a connection here between these two books. And the question is, what is the connection? Now, there's one interpretation where Robert Chester was also a fan of John Salisbury, and this inspired him to write Love's Martyr. But I'd like to give you a different interpretation. And that is that, in fact, Love's Martyr is sort of a satire or a parody of this book. So it was an inspiration, but like I was saying before, Love's Martyr is sort of intended to be sort of an insult to John Salisbury. And so this is sort of the inspiration for that insult. And in this book, there's a poem about the phoenix, where the phoenix is related to Christ, to Jesus, resurrecting from the dead. And there's a reference to the dove here. So my phoenix, like that swift returning dove, that in his mouth the branch of olive brought. So, this is probably a reference to Noah's Ark. In any case, there's a lot of talk about the phoenix and the phoenix rising again in this book relating to Jesus. And what I think happened is that the author of Love's Martyr was sort of inspired by this book, was sort of wanted to make fun of it in some way and do sort of a weird allegorical parody of it, and wanted to sort of insult John Salisbury, and this sort of provided the perfect inspiration. So as we discussed in the first video, George Chapman wrote a translation of part of the Iliad, and he published that in 1598. And this book was dedicated to the Earl of Essex. But it wasn't just dedicated to the Earl of Essex. It's dedicated to the most honored, now living instance of the Achillean virtues. Okay, so this is very extravagant praise of Essex in 1598. And of course, in the Henry V play, around 1599, William Shakespeare also praises Essex. So Chapman and Shakespeare were big supporters of Essex. And the theory of Love's Martyr is that these two supporters of Essex in 1601 put their names and contributed poems to Love's Martyr, which is an allegory that very clearly could be considered by anyone to be about the death of Queen Elizabeth and somehow the connection with Essex. It's just not a plausible theory, because both people were Essex supporters. And both people would want to stay below the radar on this issue, and there's no gain to be made by contributing these poems. So I think it's very, very, very unlikely that that's a plausible scenario. And this dedication to Essex is very strong evidence also that the dating of Love's Martyr just can't be true. Okay, so now let's look at John Marston. So before 1600, he came out with 2 books of satires, and those books were published under a pseudonym. In 1601, his first play is published. It's published anonymously. In 1602, he has 2 plays that come out, and he published them with his initials. Then in 1604, The Malcontent comes out with his full name, or in this version, just with his last name. So it's not really until 1604 that Marston is publishing under his full name. However, Love's Martyr has John Marston's full name on it. So we're supposed to believe that in 1601, when he was publishing anonymously, and before then he had been publishing with a pseudonym, he decided to put his name on this poem in this weird book that was potentially seditious. And then we have in 1605, we have Eastward Ho in 1605. And what are the names on this book? George Chapman, Ben Jonson, and John Marston. So in 1605, Marston is writing a play with George Chapman and Ben Jonson. And of course, those are the same people who contributed poems to Love's Martyr. So any which way you look at this, a 1603 or 1604 date for Love's Martyr makes more sense. It fits with the other publications of the period much better, suggesting that in 1601, John Marston was putting his name on a book. His full name is just not a realistic scenario, and we just don't have any real reason to believe that's what he would have done. So here we have part of one of Marston's poems for Love's Martyr, the first one. And it says, a narration and description of a most exact, wondrous creature. So there's a most exact and wondrous creature arising out of the phoenix and turtle dove's ashes. So this is very, very clearly making it very clear that the phoenix and the turtle dove, they're dead. They're their ashes. And out of that arises a wondrous creature, okay? Now, then look, see what glorious issue, okay? Brighter than the clearest fire, and beyond faith, far wider than Diane. Okay? Who's Diane? Well, Diana, we know, is the moon goddess, and she's the same as the goddess Cynthia. And who were both of these people closely connected to? Queen Elizabeth. So this new phoenix is far wider and a glorious issue, and is a wondrous creature arising out of these ashes, and better than Diana. Okay? Now, Queen Elizabeth was connected with the phoenix, but she was even more closely connected with Cynthia and Diana. So this is very, very, very strong evidence that the phoenix and the turtle metaphor is about Essex and Elizabeth and the rise of King James, as we talked about in the first video. And John Marston, of all the people in the world, was a satire writer and usually was very sort of obscure with his satires. They're sort of hard to read. The allegory was never clear. You never know exactly what he was talking about. But here he's just putting it right out there. This isn't even hidden at all. So there's just no question what this allegory is about. And as far as I'm concerned, there's no way it could possibly have been published in 1601. So I think this is very strong evidence for my contention that the book was published after the death of Queen Elizabeth. Okay, so this is the final part of this video. I want to look at sort of the conclusion of the main part of Love's Martyr. And here's the phoenix talking. And the phoenix says, "Stay, turtle, stay, for I will first prepare of my bones must the princely phoenix rise." So it's a princely phoenix. After the death of this phoenix, we're going to get a princely phoenix rising. Okay? And then she's suggesting that maybe we can spare the turtle's life. But the turtle says, no, no, no. Do not deny me, Phoenix. I must be a partner in this happy tragedy. And this is the martyr aspect of this. So the turtle is sort of offering himself up to martyrdom so that the new princely phoenix can rise. This is the very clear story of this poem. This isn't reading into it in any way. This is what's going on here. So at the end here, the phoenix says, "Accept into your ever-hallowed flame 2 bodies, from which we may spring one name." So she's saying that from our deaths together, there's going to be one name arising out of this. And the metaphor is clear here that it was only through the death of Essex, through the rebellion and the death of Essex and the aftermath of that, that the clean succession to King James was made possible. So Essex was martyring himself, and this made the clean transition possible, and peace and prosperity for everybody. So this is the point of this poem here, and I'm not the first one to come up with this idea. For 150 years, people have been interpreting this poem this way. They've just had a problem and how to deal with the fact that the title page is 1601. But if you say it was printed in 1603 or 1604, the whole thing makes perfect sense. So this is the part 2 video. If you haven't seen part 1, please go and watch that. And then in the future, we'll talk more about that anchor device and the crack in it, and whether we can use that to determine the date, and some other textual connections with the poem. So Love's Martyrs is super important for solving the Shakespeare authorship question. Please stay tuned for more on this topic. Click like, subscribe to the channel, and tell your friends. Thank you so much.